Welcome to the Make a Mental Note podcast, where mental health professionals share information and perspectives that illuminate, educate, and is worthy of a mental note. And now your host, Chris Quarto.
Hi, everyone. This is Chris Quarto, and welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. Well, it's the Wednesday after the presidential election, and I don't know about you, but I am so glad this is done. It's just created so much stress in me, I know, and a lot of people I know. So I'm glad it's done, and time to move on. Okay, my mental health tip for the day has to do with staying connected to your teenagers. You know, sometimes parents are at their wits' end trying to figure out how to stay connected with their teenagers, especially because, you know, it's a time of life when teenagers are starting to pull away from their parents. Well, one thing you can do is to make it a goal to improve your listening skills, and in particular, to practice listening with a third ear. And basically what I mean by this is listening for words that aren't spoken by your teenager. You know, if you think of this analogy, if you think of an iceberg, you can see its tip above water, but you know that there's a huge part underwater that you can't see. So the tip is what the teenager is telling you, talking to you about, and the stuff underneath are the thoughts and feelings, experiences that go along with the content. So the trick is to infer what the teenager is experiencing underneath the surface as they're talking about something. Now, some parents do this by trying to place themselves in the shoes of their teenager and imagine, as best as they can anyway, what they're experiencing and to communicate this to them. Other people, like this is typical of counselors in training, use a little formula called you feel because. So if the teenager is talking about a situation at school where, let's say another girl criticized her new hairstyle in front of other students, the parents might imagine how she would have felt in a situation like that and say, you know, I can see how that would have made you feel embarrassed because she said that in front of all those people. So identifying the feeling or the likely feeling and the reason for the feeling is a way of developing a deeper connection with the teenager. So anyway, these are some things that you might try, and be patient because it takes time, takes some practice to listen with a third ear. Okay, my guest today is Laura Choate, and she's actually going to be talking about parenting adolescent girls. So without further ado, here's Laura. Hi, everyone. This is Chris Quarto, and welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. I'm joined today by Laura Choate, who is a licensed professional counselor and counselor educator at Louisiana State University. And Laura, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
Sure. Well, if you wouldn't mind, share with the mental note takers a little bit more about who you are and the type of work that you do, Laura.
Okay, well, I am a licensed professional counselor, but I'm also a counselor educator. I've been a professor of counselor education at LSU for the past 17 years, and that's Louisiana State University.
Okay.
And so my primary role is teaching master's level counselors how to do counseling. So I teach the skills classes, the practicum, the internship, various courses in the master's K-Prep program. And I also teach a specialty course in girls and women's wellness, which is my research area and my favorite course to teach. And then that's the area that I've done most of my writing in. Okay. I've written 4 books, and all of them is centered around girls and women's mental health. And my most recent book is called Swimming Upstream, Parenting Girls for Resilience in a Toxic Culture, and that came out in 2015, published by Oxford University Press. And that's an exciting new adventure for me because that's the first kind of area of writing I've done that's geared directly towards parents. So my previous work has all been in counseling journals, professional journals, and written for mental health professionals.
Okay.
But this last book was my first foray into writing for the general public.
Oh, very
So that
cool.
was exciting. Yeah, very exciting, very different.
I bet it was. Yeah, it's different writing for just the layperson, I guess, as opposed to
Yes.
an academic audience. So, yeah, that's really cool.
Yes.
And I definitely want to talk about that book today. That'll be one of our major topics today. But before we even get into that, Laura, why don't we talk a little bit about how you got into the field of counseling and academia? What's your story? What's your background about how you got involved in this area?
Yes. Well, like so many people who are interested in helping professions, I started as a psychology major in college and thought, I'll get a psychology degree and become a counselor. But little did I know, you can't really do much with a psychology degree. You need to go to graduate school.
Yes.
And so from there, I investigated fields, and I thought that the best fit was counseling. And so I went straight through and also got a doctorate in counselor education because I was interested in working directly with clients. And my first area, still the area that the population I like to work with most is college students, and especially college women.
All right.
And but then I also decided, well, I would like to work in academia and be able to write and teach and as well as practice, that I thought I could have the most impact on the field that way. So I got my degree in counselor education at William and Mary, which is in Williamsburg, Virginia.
Okay. And a lot of people might not even be familiar with counselor education. They hear things like, clinical psychology or social work, but counselor education might not be one that they're quite as familiar with. Can you just say a little bit about what counselor education is, what it's about?
Yes. Well, the field of counseling, professional counseling, different states have different titles of the license. In Louisiana, it's LPC, Licensed Professional Counselor. I think that's the most commonly used term. What is the license in Tennessee?
Licensed Professional
It's
Counselor.
LPC?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so that's for people going into the field of professional counseling, they get a degree in counselor education. And for some reason, historically, the field of counseling first developed through the area of school counseling. So typically these programs are housed in colleges of education, even though the clinical mental health counseling piece is really not related to to education in any way. But they're typically housed in colleges of education, and that's the case at LSU as well. So when you get a doctorate in counselor education, it refers more to, though, that you're learning how to educate counselors, how to teach people how to become mental health counselors or school counselors or whatever their specialty may be.
Wonderful.
But there is a difference between, the licensed social workers, licensed psychologists, and licensed professional counselors. They're all different licenses, but we all kind of do similar things because we're all interested in we're all mental health helping professionals. Mental health helping professionals.
That's right. Okay, that's a really good explanation. And so your tip nowadays, you are involved in doing a lot of different things, and your primary role is to train students how to be professional counselors, and also you're an author as well. And of course, with your counselor educator role, there are a lot of different responsibilities that go along with that as well. So that's very cool to hear. Well, we talk a lot on the Make a Mental Note podcast about clients and who come in for counseling, and they're presenting with different types of issues. And of course, one of your areas of specialization is adolescent girls, and now that you've written this book about parenting and stuff. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the types of issues that adolescent girls come in for seeking treatment for, what types of things that you found maybe as common themes that kind of underlie the problems that they have, Laura.
Yes. I write a lot in the book about how today's culture is toxic for young girls as they're growing up and as they reach the early adolescent years. All the cultural pressures are just exacerbated by all the typical changes that occur as a girl goes through, reaches puberty, and encounters all the stresses that we typically think about in terms of just the physical changes she's going through in her body and her brain, cognitively, academically, the school pressures, the emerging romantic relationships.
Right.
And then when you have these cultural pressures overlaid on top of that, it becomes too much for many girls to handle. And so some of the problems that we're seeing an increase in as girls reach the adolescent years are depression and anxiety. Those are probably the two biggest. Eating disorders, substance use problems, self-injury is one that really emerges in those middle school years, and sexual assault and dating violence, which are unfortunately increasing in the middle school and early high school years. So I write in the book about the cultural pressures and then about the resulting mental disorders that can occur. And then I spend a big part of the book talking about, well, how can we build resilience? How can girls stand strong in the face of all these pressures so that these problems never occur in the first place? Well, so it's a lot about prevention.
And that's really good. That's really good information. It's interesting to hear you talk about this. You know, as you were talking about, I was thinking about the importance of just for a parent on the one hand, but even a counseling student or a student who's kind of going through graduate school to learn how to be a therapist, the importance of just knowing about normal developmental changes that take place. Isn't that critical for therapists to understand, Laura?
Yes. And that's why, at least in counseling programs, the lifespan development course is a required component of the training, because understanding what is a normal developmental process can really help a client to understand or know what to expect and to know what is outside of what's normal and what isn't. But also when you can put something in context and know, for a girl to know as she reaches puberty, she's going to start having these more emotional intensity. She's going to gain weight in areas where she doesn't want to gain weight. She's going to start getting attention from other people because of the changes in her body, and to need to know how to handle that attention. So yes, all those kinds of things are so important for clients, for counselors to be aware of, so then they can educate their clients as well.
Yeah, and I talk to my students about how all those normal developmental processes, that has to be a backdrop. I mean, that serves as a context for everything really that happens in your work, especially, I think, with all clients, but especially with kids and adolescents, because there are so many changes that they're going through, and to have that knowledge. And I think one thing that you said that makes a lot of sense is to be able to know what's typical, so that you know if you have a client who's dealing with issues that might be outside of the norm. I mean, you have to understand normal human development to understand if something is kind of getting out of the norm.
Correct.
Yeah.
And for parents to recognize just something so common, but yet parents often take it so personally when their children start to pull away from them and start to individuate and start to push away. That's a normal developmental biological mandate, if you will, that we're programmed to need to pull away so we can be independent adults one day. And that hurt for many parents who are not expecting that. That can be very painful, and they pull back on their kids, and there can be this constant turmoil instead of recognizing this is my child's way of individuating, and that I need to nurture that and accept that while still having a close connection.
Yeah, and that it's okay to start to separate. And I think that's where some parents have the problem, is that for them, they might not want their child to pull away, but for them to be able to grow normally, that's just part of that process.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing, too, is you had mentioned how society or culture really plays a big role in terms of what happens in the development of these girls. I wonder if some of the societal expectations for girls are different than they are for boys, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Right. Well, first I'll just talk about the kind of the way I see the cultural influences For girls, I call them the 3 A's.
Okay.
The first is appearance, that girls, if they look to the culture for, am I okay? Do I measure up? How do I know if I have worth and value? If they look to the culture, what they'll hear is your worth is based on your appearance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just being thin and beautiful anymore. It's about as being as hot and sexy as possible. And these messages are trickling down all the way to girls. It's even in the preschool years.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the toys that are marketed to them, the clothes, the shows that they watch, they're all, it's be as hot and sexy as possible.
Yeah.
The second A is, and I could talk about that for days. The second A is about getting attention, get as much attention as possible. And this has really blown up with social media. And so girls today can measure tangibly, they believe they can tangibly measure their worth based on how many followers they have, how many likes they have, how many friends they have, depending on, what kind of social media they're using. So as in the past, we had to wonder, when we were in middle school, like, oh, I wonder if I'm popular or not.
Yeah.
I can kind of guess.
Yep.
But now girls actually have a number. They can say, oh, she has 600 friends. I have 300.
Yes.
Therefore, I must not be as worthy as this other girl. And so this constant comparison, constant living for likes and friends and followers really sets girls up for this need, this never-ending need to feel like they measure up, and that in order to do that, they have to get as much attention as possible. And then the third A is accomplishment, which is kind of the first two are rolled into this, that you have to be perfect in every area. You have to have perfect grades, have to have perfect extracurriculars, perfect relationships, look perfect, but have this long list of accomplishments so that you can prove that you are good enough, which it's never enough. It's like this never-ending treadmill for girls. And boys have some of this too, of course, but their self-esteem, their worth isn't based as so much on their ability to look perfect, look good. I mean, a boy can feel good about himself even if he doesn't like the way he looks.
Right.
So studies show that, if a girl doesn't like how she looks, no matter if she excels in other areas, she's probably not going to have overall positive self-esteem. Whereas a boy is more likely to be able to do that. So his worth isn't based so much culturally and just overall based on his appearance. Whereas for girls, that's another stressor. The other pressure that girls they're just so much more involved on social media than boys, and they're much more likely to be comparing themselves to others through their social media, likes, followers, etc. So that's a difference, I think, two big critical differences that feed into those 3 A's and why they're worse for girls than they are for boys. Another reason it's harder for girls is because they reach puberty usually 2 years earlier than boys do on average. Okay. So all of this is hitting them at a younger age before they're cognitively prepared to deal with it. And so many girls now are going through early puberty, so they might be even 4 years earlier than boys. So they look so much older than they really are. They're put in situations maybe with an older crowd because they look like they fit in better with an older crowd because they don't really fit in with their same age peer group, and then that causes problems as well when they're put in situations that they're just not socially or cognitively prepared to handle. So that's another reason they're like going to middle school, their bodies are changing, they're hearing these cultural pressures, they're hearing, oh, your grades start to count now in the 6th grade in middle school. Yep. Everything ramps up all at the same time, whereas boys have a little longer to sort all this through. It doesn't hit them all at the same time.
Yeah. Well, as you were talking about the 3 A's, it's what struck me is that there are a lot of expectations that are not only placed upon girls, but perhaps expectations that girls place upon themselves. And where do you think those expectations come from? I know that culture is part of that, but do you think any of those expectations come from their peers and even from their parents?
Oh, definitely. So I think I've already talked about the cultural expectations, which are conveyed primarily through the media. Right. And girls are very heavy consumers of media. We already talked about social media, just being online. But even through every television show they're watching, the movies they watch, the books they read, magazines, they're hearing all the same message, which is your worth is based on your appearance, your attention, your accomplishments. That's all consistent. And if that's reinforced at home from their parents, maybe if their parents are buying into these cultural messages, if they don't hear anything different at home, it's just going to be even more solidified. And they're most likely going to hear that from their peer group, too, if their peers are heavily involved in media as well. So that's why I talk a lot about how parents have to be intentionally countercultural. They have to be willing to have a different voice, offer their children a different perspective, because all they're hearing is one thing outside the home. They're probably not going to get anything different from their peers. It's going to come from home. And the parents, that's their job, is to say, there is another way to look at this. There is another way to define yourself other than just through externals. And it can come from your inner worth and your development of an authentic self that's not based on what other people think about you.
But I bet that's challenging at times, Laura, because I'm sure, because we're talking about adolescence and kind of getting back to what you were talking about earlier in terms of this being a time when teenagers want to individuate, to kind of separate themselves from their parents, kind of developing their own identities, coming up with their own ideas for things, and maybe seeking out their peers for more advice. So I've got to believe that's tough for parents to have that kind of influence.
Exactly. That's why in the book I write a lot about this needs to start early. And the earlier you can start, the better, because in the earlier years, you really can protect your children. Your role is more to just limit media, limit the kinds of things that may be reinforcing those cultural messages. But by the time they're adolescents, your role is more to be a guide and to walk alongside them and ask the right questions, help them to question things, help them to see things from a different perspective. But certainly the parent role is to set, of course, limits, provide love and connection, be a guide, but the influence is going to be less than it would have been in the earlier years. So that's why I always say starting, I don't think there's an age where it's too early to start being mindful of these issues.
Exactly. Well, mental note takers, if you're a parent of an adolescent, and you're listening to Laura talk about these things, what are you thinking about right now? Do you have unrealistic expectations for your child? Are you giving them messages of how they should look or how they should be that really aren't in their long-term best interest? And I think these are really good things to think about. And Laura, as we talk about these girls kind of dealing with these issues, what are the feelings that kind of go along with that? Because we know that they have these pressures, they feel like they have to appear a certain way and so on and so forth. But what are some of the feelings that go along with these stresses that they're experiencing?
Well, I think the number one feeling is anxiety and just this feeling of inner turmoil and stress. I saw one study where they asked girls, I think 75% of girls that were interviewed said that they felt stressed out most of the time. And that they're just this constant, they feel like they're spinning multiple plates in the air and like, how long can I keep this up? Because they're trying to be everything to everyone. And it's impossible, obviously, to be everything to everyone all the time and to do all these things perfectly. And sometimes this goes on even into the college years, where girls just like, how long do I have to keep this up?
Right.
And so you see a lot of anxiety, the stress, the pressure, but then we're seeing a lot of depression, where girls just kind of, they can't handle it, and it's more of the withdrawal and shutting down. It's
got to be so exhausting for them to feel as though they have to maintain the appearance or whatever it is that they're dealing with. It's just got to be exhausting for them.
Yes, and if they're feeling that way at 14 or 15, how are they going to feel by the time they're 25? And
Exactly.
We're seeing them as adults in counseling sessions, therapy sessions.
Yeah. I was just kind of thinking about that. It seems like a lot of these things that they're struggling with early on in the adolescent years, and like you said, it probably starts a lot earlier than that, but I think all these things set the stage for mental health issues as they grow into adolescence.
Right. And what concerns me is this is really the first generation where girls have had to deal with these kinds of pressures. This is the first kind of social media generation where girls grew up with measuring themselves against this social media standard, where it was 24/7, having a phone, in their, glued to their face, 24, or not their face, glued to their thumbs and fingers,
right?
24 hours a day.
Yep.
And so we don't really even know the long-term implications of this because it's so new. Of a girl not having the time to develop her own identity because she's always on her phone or her device, presenting or performing. What I think that's the best way to describe it is she's not living her life, she's performing for others. So if she goes to a party, it's not just being there and hang out with her friends and having fun.
Yeah.
It's about how will this look on Instagram? What kind of soundbite can I come up with, and the perfect pictures and the perfect poses, and how's this going to look to this crowd or this crowd, instead of just being authentically in the moment. So never having that sense of being fully present and figuring out, who am I? What do I like? What do I not like? Instead of what will please the most number of people to get the most number of likes.
Isn't that interesting? Because like you said, it was so different when, we were going to school and, we were trying to figure out those questions of, who am I in such different ways. But social media has really come on the scene and changed that whole identity development, hasn't it?
Yes. And in a concerning way, because it's no longer about who you really are. It's what do other people want from me, and let me do whatever it takes in order to get that attention and to get that affirmation.
So I always talk to guests about the recipe for success, in helping clients who come in with, different types of issues to get them from point A to point B, where, at point B, it seems like they're doing better, they're functioning better, and, getting on with life and all that kind of stuff. So what do you see as the recipe for success in helping these girls who are struggling with these issues, and perhaps parents play a role in that recipe for success?
Right. That's a great question. It's an interesting question. I say, because you can think about it in so many different ways.
Yeah.
But for me, it's about, and that's why I have this in the title of the book, it's about resilience.
Yeah.
So how can girls not just kind of survive, and I think I'll get through this, or let me just rush through childhood because it's like a race just to get to college, instead of how can I be resilient and handle these challenges in a way that I'm thriving, that I'm actually enjoying my childhood and my adolescence, and that it isn't just a race where I'm checking off boxes in order to get through it and to measure up and to get to college or to get to whatever the end point might be.
Right.
So I believe that for resilience, and parents, of course, have a huge role in this, helping a girl to develop that sense of authentic self, where she really does learn what she believes and values, and that she can say no to other people, set boundaries with other people, and have healthy relationships. But at the same time, to be able to form healthy connections with other people. So how can she be connected while at the same time to be able to set boundaries, to set limits, to say no when she needs to say no. And so to have that healthy balance. And speaking of balance, I think that's another important part of resilience, is to be able to value herself in all life areas, and not just her physical appearance, or not just ability to get attention, not just ability to maybe have a million lines on her college application, but instead to appreciate her strengths in all life dimensions, and to work to build those in her spiritual self, her social self, her academics, and certainly her and leisure time, and have things that she does just for fun.
Right.
And to take the time to know what she really values and what she's really passionate about. What does she really enjoy? Those things are important too. I think also for counselors, for therapists, we can always work with girls to help them develop healthy coping skills and problem-solving skills, because that really is missing in a lot of girls today, as their emotions are rising and there are all these pressures and all these intense stressors that they're experiencing, how can they learn to manage these emotions in a more healthy way? And that's why so many girls turn to eating and binge eating or restricting. They turn to self-injury to cope with it or to numb the pain, or they turn to substances because they don't know how to regulate their emotions. So teaching healthy coping skills, emotion regulation, and problem solving instead of ruminating, because so many girls have a tendency to just talk about their problems, ruminate about their problems even with their friends, instead of taking action and doing something to make the problem better.
Right.
So when does she need to cope and when does she need to take action? I think those are critical skills that will benefit all girls.
So really, parents can play a really important role here, and I imagine that in order for them to have any kind of influence, that they have to have good communication, obviously, with their kids. But I think the other thing that you had mentioned is that instead of just focusing on their appearance, what you're advocating really is for an adolescent to be able to look at themselves more holistically and not just on that one core component of appearance that, the media is always, just emphasizing over and over. And it's such a big part of our society. But what I hear you saying is that, no, it should be more of a holistic type of focus.
Right. And that can, again, she's going to get that over and over from the media. But what parents can play a critical role from very early on in being role models in that area. So I write a lot about how mothers can be such an influence, either for good or for bad, on their daughter's body image. So if a mother feels poorly about her own body and is complaining about how much she needs to lose weight or how terrible she looks or whatever she's complaining as she looks in the mirror, her daughter's going to absorb that like through osmosis. And her daughter in turn is going to have negative body image. So even if you tell your daughter over and over, you're beautiful, you're wonderful, you're everything, you're the ideal, but a mother talks about herself negatively, the daughter's still going to have negative body image. And that research shows it's how a mother feels about her body that is the best predictor of the daughter's body image, not the message she receives. And so moms have a huge influence on their daughters and can take proactive steps in managing their own body image, but certainly being careful about what they say around their daughters and not dieting in front of their daughters, not saying that, oh, I look terrible, so I can't go to this party, or I need to lose 5 pounds before I go to the beach with friends, whatever it might be, that moms need to really put that in check. And of course, how much do fathers talk about, or do they talk about women only in terms of their appearance, or only praise women when they look good, even if they're not saying things directly to their daughters? The daughters are hearing that and learning that's what's important. That's
interesting. The parents might not even be aware of what kind of influence they have on their kids just by virtue of modeling, of either modeling things or just these statements that they're saying. That's really an interesting point. Now, what are some of the challenges in working with kids who are, struggling with these issues, especially girls who are struggling with either how they appear or, the low self-esteem? What are some of the challenges in a counseling context, Laura, in working with adolescent girls?
Well, the biggest challenge is you have to override the culture that the messages that they're hearing 24/7. And so it's going to be hard for them to say, oh, well, my counselor's telling me this, that I need to view myself in this way and not compare myself with other people, and that to value myself for who I am, and that I do have these strengths, and that I can think about things differently and tell myself a more, rational way of viewing things. But then the minute they leave the therapy office, they're going to have had, 10 notifications, probably 100 notifications about social media updates about how they don't measure up.
Right.
And so it really is a lot. I mean, I think one way to overcome this, and this is really hard, but working with parents and encouraging adolescents to take media breaks, to put the phone down, to intentionally have times throughout the day where they're not connected.
Oh my God, they'd probably go through
unplugged time.
Probably go through withdrawal, wouldn't they?
Oh, I mean, I see it even in my graduate students when I say there'll be no cell phones in class, and I can see if you're texting under the table.
Yes.
And so they do put them away, but then the minute I say, okay, let's take a 10-minute break, and they like pull out their phones and they frantically start texting like, oh, I can have my drum
That's
back.
amazing.
And and that's with graduate students. Yeah. So it's even worse with, adolescents who that really is their lifeline. But yeah, I mean, I do. It may seem unrealistic, but it's really the only way of having that intentional downtime where they can start to reflect and develop a sense of self outside of that.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just really one of the few ways that that's going to happen.
I think that'll be
encouraging. Encouraging face-to-face conversations is another one because students today don't have as much empathy for other people, including for themselves, I think, because everything is done through texting and not direct communication. So the art of reading facial cues, understanding how your words impact someone else, that's being lost as well.
And, I think the next big thing will probably be technology addiction, in terms of what mental health therapists will be dealing we talk about process addictions like gambling and things of that nature. And of course, you can kind of see this coming on the scene where everybody has to have their phone and they literally go through withdrawal if they can't have it. So it's a real interesting type of thing. Well, this last part of the interview, Laura, is what I call make a mental note, and I ask guests to come up with if they have a tip or a word of wisdom that they can give to the audience members that they can make a mental note of to kind of help them just in daily life. And do you have any tips or words of advice that can help the audience member along these lines?
Yes, I think that. I guess if I could have two. One is directly to parents, because I have two different audiences here. And I think one would be to parents to really think about what kind of person do you want your child to be? What is your end goal? And then as you're making parenting decisions along the way, is that really going to help her or hinder her from becoming the kind of person you want her to be?
Right.
And a lot of times when you answer those questions, that's going to require you to make countercultural decisions, do things in a way that other people aren't doing them, and to be willing to, as I have in the title of my book, be willing to swim upstream and do things differently, even when it's harder, because that's what's best for your child. And I know that's not easy, but that's so important because the culture is very negative for girls today. So to be willing to do things differently and take that stand is so important. And I have an 11-year-old daughter, so I'm in the middle of this right now, having to make these choices and take the stand every single day. And so I'm having to practice what I preach.
Wow.
And not always easy. But luckily I've done the groundwork, so it's not as hard for me right now as I think a lot of people, or at least the people, her friends' parents that I'm around, that it's not as difficult right now because she's been protected in many ways from a lot of these cultural messages.
Well,
the other thing, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I like what you said. You laid the groundwork, and I think that's an important thing for parents to hear too, that this, addressing these issues just doesn't necessarily start when a girl turns 13. These issues start way longer than that. So I like that, how you said that. But go ahead and mention your second point there, Laura.
I think it's what your question was more directly related to, for therapists in working with their clients, to just be aware that these cultural messages have accumulated and are really intense for girls today, because when you live in a culture, you're not always as aware of the recent changes that have occurred. It's just kind of like, well, this is the way things are, and there's really nothing we can do about it, instead of stepping back and looking at, and that's what I've done in this book, and I've done really for the past 15 years. I've watched, how is the culture influencing girls today, and how really harmful it is for them, and that they don't know any other way. This is what the world that they live in. This is what they live and breathe, and they don't know any other way. So that as therapists, I think it goes back to what you talked about at the very beginning, understanding development. Well, part of girls' development today is not just what we're learning in the textbook.
Right.
It's also the cultural influences that are hitting girls right as they're from an early age, but it really intensifies as they reach puberty and they're going through so many physical changes as well. So to really support girls, provide extra support for girls at this time, because they are so vulnerable to so many different mental disorders and issues that develop at that age, such as depression, which triples in girls between the ages of 12 and 15.
Wow.
But at age 12, there's no gender difference between boys and girls in depression, but by age 13, it's a 2-to-1 ratio in terms of girls versus boys, and it stays at that throughout the rest of their lives.
Is that right?
That's the point where the gender differences emerge. The 2-to-1 ratio emerges right between age 12 and 13, and like I said, between ages of 12 and 15, the depression rates triple in girls.
Wow.
And it's such a vulnerable time for them. It's such a time where we can either intervene early when symptoms first start to emerge, or when a girl first starts having problems, which is going to be so much more effective and set her up for providing her with coping skills and the problem-solving strategies that then she can use that maybe will prevent other mental health problems from occurring for the rest of her life. So I think maybe the bottom line is that early prevention when she's younger, but certainly early intervention is necessary because it is such a vulnerable time for girls.
That's so interesting, and it's so critical for both parents and counselors, therapists who are going to end up working with pre-adolescents, adolescents, to be aware of that. I had never really known that, but that was an interesting fact. Well, Laura, there might be some people who want to follow up and ask you some questions, and also if you could tell the mental note takers how they could get a hold of your book. So if you could just start off with your contact information, email address or whatever, and then tell us how we can get a hold of your book.
Okay. My email is lchoate, Choate, at lsu.edu.
Okay.
And my book, Swimming Upstream, Parenting Girls for Resilience in a Toxic Culture, is available through Amazon, through all major booksellers.
All righty. And
go ahead.
Yes,
I was just going to say, I also have a Twitter handle is just at Dr. Laura Choate.
Fantastic. So I'm going to make sure and put all of that information in the show notes, so if anybody either wants to get a hold of you or purchase your book, they can get that information easily. Well, Laura, thanks so much for being part of this podcast. This was a fascinating conversation. I think that the listeners will really learn a lot about this, and I think, again, one of the major issues is just really to be aware of some of those normal developmental issues, but in particular, some of these issues that you said that girls deal with. I think that this is really great information that you shared, and appreciate you coming on the podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Okay, I appreciate Laura coming on the podcast today to talk about some of the issues that adolescent girls deal with and how their parents help them. And here's my mental notes takeaway. Helping girls view themselves holistically and taking the focus off their physical appearance or some other trait that's emphasized by their peers or social media is an important part of raising a well-rounded person. Now, here's my question for you. How do parents help their girls develop resilience? Well, Laura spoke about how girls develop resilience when their parents instill in them a core set of values that help them stay true to themselves, especially when peers question why they're not doing what everyone else is doing, and when social media sets expectations to engage in certain types of behavior. She also had talked about how values help girls set boundaries with peers and form healthy connections with them. So helping girls appreciate and value their strengths also plays an important role in developing resilience. So good food for thought. All right. Well, as always, if you'd like the show notes for today's podcast episode, then please visit my website, chrisquarto.com. If you'd like to automatically receive podcast episodes on your smartphone or tablet, it's really easy to do that by using an app such as Downcast. That's the app that I use on my smartphone to listen to other people's podcast episodes, and it works like a charm. As I had said before, my podcast episodes come out every Thursday. So thanks so much again for listening to the Make a Mental Note podcast, and have a great rest of the week.